Further, the truth of this story of Portrayed Armentarius is beyond all doubt, for it was reported to the domvirs of Nancy in absolute completeness with its questions, proofs and arguments. It was, moreover, fully confirmed by the inhabitants of the place, who assured many persons that they had seen with their own eyes the boy recalled to an appearance of life. As for the obscene relations of Portrayed with the Succubus, the truth could only be known from the man himself. Welcome listener, I am the Succubus Scholar and today we shall be covering a particularly dark tale. Those of you who have watched my videos on Medicine or Meridiana may be thinking that having an ever-real lover is a wonderful thing, akin to a fairy tale. Alas, just like with mortal lovers, it can actually be an intense relationship with many hardships to overcome. And also, just like with mortal relationships, sometimes it can be toxic. Just as there are many bad eggs in human society, there are as such in the realm of the Lilin. Perhaps more likely so, as they sometimes see mortals more as toys than lovers, unless they perceive something particularly special within. One such Lilin, or Succubus, is that disclosed with Nicholas Remy's Demonolatria Libitress, later translated and better known as Demonolatry, a work that would become a staple in any witch hunter's library, and would overtake the renowned Malleus Maleficarum as the go-to guide regarding all things witchcraft. Remy's path into the life of a witch hunter is a fascinating if tragic one. In 1582, after refusing to give a beggar woman any money, she would openly curse Remy. The judge of Lorraine might have paid it no mind, had his son not died in a street accident shortly after. Grieved, Remy would successfully try the beggar woman and have her put to death. Thus would begin his campaign of terror, where he would boast as having sentenced 800 witches to burn at the stake, before retiring in 1592 to escape the plague. In Lorraine, during the 16 years in which I have judged prisoners charged with this crime, no less than 800 have been clearly proved guilty, and condemned to death by our domvirs. Besides, nearly as many more who have saved their lives by flight or by stubborn endurance of the torture. For the trial of such cases is so beset with doubts and perplexities, that the judge is very often balked of his expectations, as we shall explain more fully in due course. So before I start, listener, I would stress that this account is taken from a time of severe prejudice, religious tension and superstitious fear that would rightfully not be accepted today. Just as the Malleus Maleficarum should be approached with the knowledge that its author was an unhinged madman, detested by many who actually knew him, Demonolatry should be approached with the knowledge that its author, although of somewhat sound mind, held heavy bias and unfaltering belief in his narrow-minded actions. With that little forewarning out of the way, let us proceed with the tragic story of Remy and Abrahel. It is the time of what is known today as the 80 Years' War. It is a subject of history that is too complex to cover in depth here and beyond my expertise. But in short, the area known today as Belgium sought to unify and free themselves from their Spanish Catholic master, the Emperor of Spain, becoming an independent and Protestant state as per the Reformation. It was a time of much tension, with fights that would break out between Catholics and Protestants in cities, in one instance leading up to a full-blown battle and siege. War makes beasts of us all, and this was no exception. Just 3 years prior to the incident with Abrahel, just a few miles north of Dalhem, the siege of Maastricht had taken place. The citizens fought against the Spanish offensive bravely, with even the women and children aiding the defenders. But it was to no avail, and when the Spanish broke in, it was no longer soldiers who flooded the city, but monsters every bit as cruel as Abrahel. The atrocities committed that day are too grim to mention here, listener, but know that the women and children were not spared, the population massacred in vile and gruesome ways. So I ask you, is it any wonder that it was thought that witchcraft was on the rise during this time? With bloody feuds between Catholics and Protestants, is it any wonder that the suffering peasantry, who just wanted a fruitful crop and a peaceful life, would grow sickened by their supposed benevolent God and turn to the night side? For the few who were guilty of dabbling in the occult, this was probably the main driver, desperately seeking supernatural means to keep their starving family fed. but there are many accounts from these trials where people acted not for personal gain, but out of spite. They would aim to cast malicious curses born of aggravation or jealousy of their neighbours. It was jealousy of his fellow herdsmen that would motivate our protagonist, or perhaps antagonist, here to practice his sorcery. A quick note. In the translated version of Demonology by Montague Summers, Petroni's surname changes throughout the work, sometimes Armentarius, and at other times Armentières, suggesting he was originally from that city. But as I have stated before, listener, never trust a translated work. I managed to find a copy of the original Latin version, and it is indeed given just as Petronus Armentarius, of which the surname originates from Latin as herdsman for livestock. As such, this was his occupation at Dalhem, or Dalheim as Summers writes it. But clearly he was flagging behind his fellow counterparts, and rather than seeking to reach their level, he instead brought them down to his own. Sometimes a man becomes jealous of one of his fellows who has been careful and diligent in caring for his flocks, and is anxious to find some means of venting his spite upon him without incurring any suspicion. Then some demon comes to aid in the shape of a preying wolf, which rushes upon the flocks and slaughters them, after which the man accuses his fellow servant before their master of negligence, so that at last he has to make good the loss out of his own wages. Petroni Armentarius of Dalheim and Johannes Malvilsius of Sulzbad freely confessed that they had often done this among other manifestations of this abominable art. And they added that the following was the means they used to summon the demon to their assistance. They tore up some grass and threw it against the trunk of a tree, saying certain words. And at once there came out a wolf, which immediately fell upon the designated flocks. Indeed, there could be no more fitting agent for such a work than that beast, which is more than all the others, endowed by the nature of depredation. It is not stated if the demon Petrone brought forth in the guise of a wolf was Abrahel herself, or if he had learned the spell from Abrahel. Either way, this shows that this Petrone certainly had some knowledge of the occult that he practiced. Neither does Remy state how Petrone came to meet Abrahel. However, Remy states elsewhere in his work that, as a pig returns to its wallowing place, so a demon's favourite habitation is in corpses, and as such are often found in graveyards, places of punishment and execution for criminals. Perhaps on one such dark night in his local graveyard, Petrone saw arcane aid, and Abrahel answered his summons. This supposedly favoured habitation may also explain Abrahel's later actions. Another possible answer as to how they met is found via another tale of a succuba Remy claims to have heard from a compatriot. Another herdsman grew so desirous of a woman that he dreamed of her frequently until one day he was in a meadow and spotted a woman who looked alike to her, whom he tried to seduce. After some banter, she agreed on the condition that she be acknowledged as his mistress and she be treated by him as though she were God himself. As we shall see, this sounds rather similar to Abrahel's behaviour, and would be unsurprising to me if it is the same one preying upon lonely herdsmen in the region. The typical price for Abrahel as a succubus would be to fornicate with him. Petroni would state that when they did so, his limbs would become stiff, rendering him immobile, typical of those who encounter succubi as phantoms of sleep paralysis and night terrors. There was some debate as to the purpose of this fornication during this period. Remy subscribed to the most popular theory then, that demons cannot procreate themselves, for only those of God can create life. Instead, he quotes the work of other authors, in particular Ludovico Maria Sinistrari, stating that they take the form of a succubus to take the seed of men, and when they find a willing mortal woman, they transform into an incubus and inject it into them. These women then willingly give birth to more demons into the world. Indeed, Remy would state that female demons are exceedingly rare, and that in his time as a witch hunter, the case of Abrahel is the only one case of a succubus he would come across. His reasoning for this is that the modesty of women is harder to imitate, and that, in true chauvinistic style for that time, the fairer sex is more feeble in its understanding and as such make for easier prey. If you would permit a digression, on this topic another succubus case is briefly mentioned by Remy by the name of Schwarzberg, German for Black Mountain, perhaps named for her pale pallor and long black hair and garments. Hennezel Eric from Vergerville stated that entering his succuba was akin to entering an ice-rimmed cavity, and as such could never finish the act with her. He would claim to have been introduced to her by his mother and father, Ericus and Katerina, who attended Sabbaths by flying out on a ball and a fork. Henzel would state he was madly in love with Strasbourg, despite the hooves she had for feet. But whilst he would wallow in carnality, it would become akin to being doused with cold water. His parents would be tried in July 1586. However, Abrahel would demand more than that. For her aid, Abrahel would demand a far greater price than just coitus. Desperate, struggling in these dangerous and bloody times, Petroni would fulfil his end of the bargain. His succubus Abrahel forced him to fulfill his solemnly given promise to commit foul murder upon his only son. And when he could not endure his loss, and was driven nearly mad by the thought of the infanticide, which he had perpetrated, she promised that, if he implored her with supplication and adoration, she would bring the boy back to life. And accordingly, for a whole year she caused him by her magic to appear as if he were living and exercising his natural functions. That this was no more than a deception and illusion was clearly and abundantly shown when, without any previous illness, the boy again died, and immediately began to stink so abominably that it was impossible to look at him except from a distance, and that with the nostrils pressed close together. Petroni murdered his own son as a sacrifice to Abrahel, despite his own misgivings, but the grief would become too much, and, in exchange for total adoration, Abrahel would agree to bring his son back from the dead. But Remy would state in this work that demons are incapable of such fates. Instead, they can only occupy the corpse with one of their little helpers, or themselves, and puppet the body to provide the illusion. Such would become apparent to Petroni when the son, seemingly from no illness, would die a year later, and, the illusion dispelled, reveals that the body had been rotting all this time. It would be then that Petroni would be called to give his account, no doubt forced by the horrified villagers, though the result of the trial is never stated. However, with Remy as the judge, he would proudly claim that he had sentenced 800 people to burn at the stake for the crime of witchcraft. I feel Petroni met a most agonising end. Remy's view of witches is summarised at the end of the work. For my part, who have been so long and continuously exercised and confirmed in the examination of witches, I shall not fear to proclaim freely and openly my opinion of them, and to do all in my power to bring the very truth to light, namely, that their lives are so notoriously befouled and polluted by so many blasphemies, sorceries, prodigious lusts, and flagrant crimes, that I have no hesitation in saying that they are justly to be subjected to every torture and put to death in the flames, both that they may expiate their crimes with a fitting punishment, and that its very awfulness may serve as an example and a warning to others. Truly, this account conjures images deserving of a horror movie. A down-on-his-luck farmer in a time of war, resorting to seeking the aid of a beautiful succubus, failing to see the ugliness within. Petroni being led astray and drawn deeper and deeper until he is forced to commit an act he would never forgive himself for. Then for a village to be horrified to learn that they have had a putrefying corpse walking amongst them for the past year. But, as we have seen in my other videos, succubi do not always lead to such tragedy. More often than not, they simply seek a mortal partner to bear children with. And in return, the mate is gifted with knowledge and abilities beyond their ken. So what caused Abrahel to torment Petroni then? Well, as some of you may have noticed, Petroni was clearly not that well versed in the occult. Unsurprising, as the peasantry of that time were rarely literate. One of the first rules when calling forth such creatures is to retain their actual name. Abrahel was not the succubus' real name. The first red flag should have been the L at the end. Generally, this means the being is angelic in origin, and no succubus would be able to make that claim. The reason for the initial part of the name, Remy himself would reveal. When God wished to test Abraham's faith, he appeared to him and, having enumerated all his benefits to him, bade him offer up his son Isaac as a sacrifice. So Abraham, thinking it a sin not to obey God in anything whatsoever, took his son to the mountain which God had named, and was there about to offer the sacrifice demanded, had not God himself interceded to prevent him, proclaiming that he was not a god to wish him to be cruelly bereft of his children, after having graciously made him a father in his extreme old age, but that he only wished to make trial whether he would obey such a command. Even so, it now delights that ape, the demon, to reenact an imitation of that which God did so many ages ago. And indeed, it is probable that he purposely took the name Abrahel, in this case to give some verisimilitude to his travesty of Abraham's sacrifice. But in the event he departed from his pattern, and that it was with a special care and purpose to imbue the father's hands with the unnatural murder of his son, against his deeply inborn parental love. For of a truth, he was a murderer from the beginning. Abrahel was playing out a twisted version of the binding of Isaac, taking the role of God and having Petrone take the role of Abraham. The blasphemous difference obviously being that where Abraham was halted in his act, Petrone was made to see it through. That Petrone was aggrieved by the loss of his son was seen as an opportunity by Abrahel to bind Petrone to herself all the more, offering to resurrect his son in return for total adoration, allowing her to play at being God that much longer. The true identity of Abrahel will never be known, though the views of that time would simply be that it was the devil in female disguise. But it should serve as a warning to those of you who would dabble with entities beyond this plane of existence. When designing your rituals, make preparations to derive their actual names, or you too may be unwittingly dragged down into an icy pool of despair until you drown completely. Thank you for listening. I hope this helped provide some in-depth info and understanding of one of the better-known succubi out there, as well as a bit of awareness for the lesser-known Schwarzberg, who has been forgotten in favour of Abrahel. I have stated before how the Lilin are misunderstood and hold different stances to us mortals. This story also provides a warning of how they can see us as playthings more than lovers. Many a petitioner has given an excellent warning with regards to working with Lilith and her daughters, that you must never seek them out, for it is they who seek you out when you attain their interest. I may provide a video on what the signs are that they have taken an interest in you, but in truth there are plenty of articles and videos out there that provide this, and I want this channel to be more on the mythology without focusing on modern occultism too heavily. However, just be aware that if you try to bring them to you and they are not interested, you may end up a plaything just as Petrone was, to grant them amusement and then be discarded when bored. But I would also stress that this was a time when lunatics with the title Witch Hunter Generals stalked the lands. Who knows truly how Petrone came to be in Remy's clutches, and what stories may have parted from his lips when a little convincing was applied. With that, I shall draw this video to a close. As stated before, I have plenty of other subjects I want to cover, the Queen of Sheba, Asmodeus and more, but I work with my own patron muse, who directs me as she sees fit. So until next time, listener, may Lilith grant you pleasant dreams.